What's up, YouTube? Before I get into the video, let me remind you that if you like my content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Also, if you want to be notified when the videos post, hit the bell icon. And finally, if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on my Patreon at patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do all of this in my free time, so any amount of support can help me bring more of this content to you more often. Alright, today we are going to look at another deck tech. We're looking at Ghyrson Starn Kellermorph. This is a card that came in the 40k Commander precons. This one specifically came in the Tyranid precon, and it was kind of out of place. There was very little in the Tyranid precon that did exactly 1 damage. And the Tyranid precon was specifically built in a way to get a ton of +1/+1 counters, so even the creatures attacking weren't actually going to be doing 1 damage. So, it just didn't feel like it was in the right place. So, it was an easy way, or it was an easy card to cut from Tyranid, but it also is an incredibly good commander. So really quickly, we're going to look at it. It is a 3/2 that costs 3, 1 colorless, 1 blue, 1 red. It has Ward 2, so it punishes people for wanting to target it, which is fantastic. It has 3 auto stubs. Whenever another source you control deals exactly 1 damage to a permanent or player, Ghyrson Starn Kellermorph deals 2 damage to that permanent or player. There are some really cool strategies with this. I've seen Spellslinger strategies that want to use things like Lava Dart, or Spikefield Hazard, or Grape Shot, and then take advantage of things like Chandra's Incinerator, Kessick Flame Breather, Gelectrode, stuff like that, Electrostatic Barrier, in order to use these cards that deal exactly 1 damage so that Kellermorph can make it 3 damage. It is a phenomenal strategy. It's an insanely consistent strategy, and it is not what I'm doing. So I decided to go with just straight pingers. So we're going to take a look at that right now. So there's our Kellermorph. We're going to pull this off, and we're going to look at creatures first. Again, typically I wouldn't, I would kind of break this into the types of cards that I have in this deck, but since this is a straightforward pingers deck, and almost all pingers are creatures, I just separated it as normal. So we're going to look at creatures first. Starting with Chandra's Incinerator. It is 5 and a red for a 6/6. It costs less for the amount of non-combat damage that you dealt this turn. So potentially if you deal up to 5 damage, this guy can cost just 1 red. And it has to be non-combat damage. That is one of the caveats. So combat damage isn't going to work, which is perfect for this deck because we're not going to do combat damage. Most pingers, if you're not aware, are actually really low toughness and sometimes no power at all. This one has trample, but the important part here is whenever a source deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to the creature, planeswalker, or opponent as well. And that's really cool because our pingers are hitting for 1, and then Chandra's Incinerator is then turning around and hitting for 1, and then Ghyrson Starn is seeing both of those. So the pinger is going to hit for 1, Ghyrson Starn is going to hit for 2. And then Chandra's Incinerator is going to hit for 1, and then Ghyrson Starn is going to hit for 2. And I think that deals non-combat damage. Chandra's Incinerator will copy the Ghyrson Starn triggers as well. It's just that Ghyrson Starn won't infinitely loop with it unless you somehow drop his damage to 1 somehow. No, there's no way. There's no way to infinite loop it, but it's really powerful in this deck because there's a lot of non-combat damage going on. Next up, we have Cinder Pyromancer. It is amongst many different pingers in here. This is a 3 for a 0/1. Basically, tap it to deal 1 damage to target player. And whenever you play a red spell, you may untap it. This is typical in the Spellslinger strategy as well, because you get to untap it every time you play a red spell. So that includes Lava Darts, that includes Grape Shots, so on and so forth. Next up, we have Cunning Spark Mage, 2 and a red for a 0/1 haste that you can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. You're going to see a couple of different types of pingers in here. The first pinger that we looked at, Cinder Pyromancer, only hits players, specifically a target player. Cunning Spark Mage actually hits players or creatures. There is other pingers in here that will hit only creatures. And then finally, there are pingers in here that will hit all opponents all at once. Next up, we have Defiler of Instinct. This is a fantastic card in here. Defiler of Instinct is 4/4/4/4. Has first strike and has an additional cost to cast red spells. You may pay 2 life instead of paying the red part of their mana cost. So we can turn the red cost on all spells that we play into Phyrexian mana if we so choose to. But the best part here is whenever you cast a red permanent spell, which is a large portion of the cards in here, Defiler of Instinct deals 1 damage to any target. And Ghyrson Starn is going to see that, and it's just a really good card in here. If you can get this out early, you really put yourself in a very threatening position. Next up, we have Exalted Flamer of Tzeentch, another really good one. This is also a really good one for the Spellslinger strategy. We are running spells in here. We are just not running heavy amounts of spells like the Spellslinger strategy would. It is, like I said, much more efficient that way. If you run the spells as opposed to the number of pingers I'm running. The deck can be extremely fast if you do it the other way, the way I'm not doing it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Flamer of Tzeentch is 4. It is a 2/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, you get to return a instant or sorcery card from your graveyard at random. So that's actually really fantastic, especially in the Spellslinger deck. We have a ton of spells in here, just the same. So we're still going to see those recursions of spells. And then finally, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Exalted Flamer of Tzeentch deals 1 damage to each opponent. So another just fun way to cast a whole bunch of spells and deal damage. But that's not what we're doing. Next up, we have Firebrand Archer. 1 and a red for a 2/1. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. There are quite a few creature spells in here, but there is a huge amount of non-creature spells. So this is going to see a lot of interaction. It's not going to see nearly as much interaction if I was to focus it towards Spellslinger as opposed to pingers, but it's just more fun this way. Next up, we have Gelectrode. 3 for a 0/1. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to any target. You also can untap it if you cast a instant or sorcery. So again, very good in both decks. Then we have Chain Whirler. 3 for a 3/3 first strike. When Chain Whirler enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. This is absolutely phenomenal with Ghyrson Starn in play, because we're talking tons of damage hitting the field. Yes, your opponents are only taking 3, but each of their creatures are probably taking 3 as well. It might not wipe the board, but it will cause a huge amount of threat. Then we have Goblin Fireslinger, 1 for a 1/1. Tap it to deal 1 damage to target player. We have Goblin Sharpshooter, probably one of the best pingers in here, and you'll see why as we get deeper into the deck. But Goblin Sharpshooter is 3 for a 1/1. Doesn't untap during your untap step. When a creature dies, untap Goblin Sharpshooter, and you can tap Goblin Sharpshooter to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Like I said, you'll see why this gets really good in this deck, but even with Ghyrson Starn, that's 3, so you can actually take out something that has 3 toughness, untap it, and then keep pinging. But there is actually an even better thing to do with this, and it is why this card is so good in this deck. Next up we have Izzet Staticaster. 3 for a 0/3. It has Flash, it has Haste. And you can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature and each other creature with the same name as that creature. This is an amazing token killer. With Ghyrson Starn in play, it can kill things with toughness of 3. So if there's a bunch of beasts on the table, you have a way of killing all those beasts just through 1 card. Next up, we have Kessig Flamebreather, 2 for a 1/3. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Kessig Firebreather deals 1 damage to each opponent. These are really, really important in this deck. There's a lot of pingers in here that just deal 1 damage to a target specifically. So having the pingers in here that deal damage to each opponent is really important, especially in a multiplayer game. Next up, we have Lobber Crew. This guy is 0/4 with Defender for 3. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to each opponent. And whenever you cast a multicolored spell, you get to untap it. And again, we're not focusing on the idea of untapping these cards that can untap. But that being said, there are enough things in here to at least untap them every now and then. Really what we're focusing on is just flooding the board with pingers and making it very, very difficult on your opponents. Next up, we have Nettle Drone. 3 for a 3/1 Devoid. Nettle Drone, you can tap Nettle Drone to deal 1 damage to each opponent. So again, we're hitting each opponent. And you can untap it when you play a colorless spell. Right now, the only colorless spells you're going to see in here are going to be artifacts, but it still sees the artifacts and still gets untapped by them. So that's pretty cool. Now we have 2 different Niv Mizzets in here. We have Niv Mizzet Perun. Niv Mizzet Perun is one of those that you're probably going to see in the Spellslinger version because it sees instant and sorcery spells being cast and allows you to draw cards. And upon drawing cards, you deal 1 damage because of Niv Mizzet. It's to any target, so it's only a 1 target, but it's still really good in both this one and the Spellslinger version because it's 1 damage and it procs off of anytime you draw a card. So even if you're not drawing cards because you played an instant or sorcery, anytime you draw a card, you're still dealing damage. Other part about this, it can't be countered. And it's a 5/5 with flying, so super good body. The other Niv Mizzet we're running is the original Niv Mizzet. The original Niv Mizzet also says the same thing where if you draw a card, it deals 1 damage to any, well, in this case, target creature or player, not any target, but, you know, it is what it is. It is a 4/4 with flying, but you can also tap it to draw a card. And if you do tap it to draw a card, both Niv Mizzet Perun and this Niv Mizzet are going to see that and deal damage. So just really good pingers there. Then we have the OG Pinger. Well, I guess this isn't the OG Pinger. This is the copy of the OG Pinger. This is Prodigal Pyromancer. 3 for a 1/1. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. And then we have the OG Pinger, Prodigal Sorcerer. This is probably one of the first pingers to be printed. I'm fairly confident of that. It is 3 for a 1/1. Tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. And yes, they are roughly the same thing. These Prodigal Pyromancers were introduced in the Time Spiral block, the original Time Spiral block. We got ourselves a Razorfin Hunter from Apocalypse. It's 2 for a 1/1. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. So you can see the theme here is mostly going to be targeted non-combat damage, but there are still quite a few in here that do it to all opponents. Then we got Rootwater Hunter from Tempest. This is 3 for a 1/1. Tap deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Then we got Spear Spewer. 1 for a 0/2 Defender. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to each player. Oh, including yourself. Yikes. Well, that doesn't matter. So, just to clear something up so that everyone is aware, yes, if you deal 1 damage to yourself, Ghyrson Starn is still going to see that and deal damage to yourself. So you have to be careful about that, and you'll see more of those cards where I'm going to mention that, but Spear Spewer is one of those where he's going to deal damage to you as well. Then we got Suk'Atah Firewalker. Suk'Atah Firewalker. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't really know. 3 for a 0/1. It can't be the target of red spells or effects, which is super cool because it kind of just means that you have to kill it other ways than burning it. And I thought that was really thematically funny, although completely ineffective these days, but still very cool. You can tap Suk'Atah Firewalker to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Then we got Tandem Lookout. Tandem Lookout is not actually a pinger, but it does something that is really good for pingers in that when you soulbind it, when you bind it to a partner, whenever that creature or Tandem Lookout deals damage to an opponent, you get to draw cards. So this is going to be one of many card draw engines in this deck. It only ever is going to be paired to 1 creature, so only the Tandem Lookout and that creature are going to draw you cards, but it's still really cool to just get that card draw, and especially because you don't necessarily have to do combat damage, it's just damage in general. Next up we have Thermal Alchemist, another one that would be in both decks. Thermal Alchemist is 2 for a 0/3 with Defender. You can tap Thermal Alchemist to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get to untap him. Next we have Thornwind Fairies, 3 for a 1/1 flying. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Next up, we have Vithian Stinger. This is 3 for a 0/1 with Unearth for 2. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Really big fan of the Unearth here. Your opponents are going to actively work to kill both Ghyrson, Starn, and your pingers throughout the course of the game, so having a pinger that can come back is kind of nice. Next up, we have Volshock Sorcerer, and you're probably wondering, how is it possible there's so many pingers? Because that's how I felt. Volshock Sorcerer is 3 for a 1/1. It has haste, and Volshock Sorcerer can be tapped to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. And then finally, we have Ghyrson Spellcaster, all the way back to Ice Age. This is 3 for a 1/1. You can see how heavily played this card is. It's old. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. So those are our pingers and our pinger support, which included, I guess, 1 card in the form of Tandem Lookout, although I would say Chandra's Pyromancer is also really good at being pinger support. Next up, we're going to take a look at the instants that we have, and you're going to be not horribly surprised by them. It's not going to be the same pool of instants that you would see in a Spell Slinger deck, because there's still a bunch of spells that we could have used that we just outright didn't. I'm pretty sure I don't have Lava Dart in here, as well as quite a few other really good targets for Ghyrson, but I didn't want to build the Spell Slinger, so there you go. Starting with Brainstorm. Pretty simple. You're going to draw 3 cards and then put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your library in any order. Then we have a Chaos Warp. For 3, you get to take a permanent that your opponent... Well, actually, it doesn't have to be an opponent's permanent. You just take a permanent, shuffle it into its owner's library. The owner reveals the top card of their library, and if it is a permanent, they put it into play. Then we have our standard counterspell. There is only one other spell that I think is better than this in the form of paying 2 mana, and I do mean by paying for it. Obviously, Force of Will, Force of Negation, and Fierce Guardianship, stuff that you don't have to pay for, is obviously better, but if you have believe it's a Mana Drain. Mana Drain also costs 2, counters a spell, but also gives you mana for the amount of the, or the CMC of the spell that you countered, so just outright better. But I don't have that, so I have Counterspell. Next up, we have Dramatic Reversal. For obvious reasons. For 1 and a blue, you can untap all permanents you control. So anything that didn't untap before, you could just forcibly untap it and probably shut out the game at that point. Dramatic Reversal can be very dramatic. Next up, we have Electrickery. This is one of those that you would see in a Spellslinger deck. For 1 red, Electrickery deals 1 damage to target creature you don't control, and you can overload it for 1 and a red. So for 1 and 2 red, you can deal 1 damage to each creature you don't control, and that's just mean. That's just mean. We also have Electrolyze. For 1 and a blue and a red, you can counter... Oops. I didn't know that was the same card. My bad. Electrolyze deals 2 damage, divided as you choose among 1 or 2 targets, and you get to draw a card. If you split it between 2 targets, that is a spell dealing exactly 1 damage. So Ghyrson Starn will see that, and instead of it doing 2 damage to 1 target, it will actually deal 3 damage to 2 targets, and that's just absolutely beautiful. Then we have Negate. Obviously, there are better counter target non-creature spell available, but you know, Negate is a staple. So we got Polymorphous Jest. Polymorphous Jest is one of the reasons that the Goblin Sharpshooter is absolutely one of the best pingers in this deck. If you do not have Ghyrson Starn in play, but you do have Goblin Sharpshooter in play, and you cast Polymorphous Jest, you essentially wipe all of your opponent's boards clean, and you have a clean slate, even without Ghyrson Starn in play. So this is just a really awesome way to board wipe, and there are going to be quite a few other spells, not just Goblin Sharpshooter, but there's a few spells in here that deal damage to creatures in the form of 1 damage that will also wipe a board with Polymorphous Jest. We don't have a lot in the way of what I would consider traditional board wipes in here, because we have Polymorphous Jest and another card in here. And then finally, the last of the instants, we have Spikefield Hazard. Spikefield Hazard obviously is in here because it just deals 1 damage to any target. But also, if you're in a position where you need a land, this is modal double-faced, so it is also a land. Next, we'll take a look at the sorceries, and again, if we were playing a spell slinger deck, there would be a lot more of these. But because we are focusing specifically on the pingers and the idea of just putting pingers in play and using them, this is going to be a little bit lighter. So, starting with Blazing Volley for 1 red, you deal 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. And again, with Polymorphous Jest, that just turns into a one-sided board wipe. And the Festivities for 1 red, and the Festivities deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. And so again, with Polymorphous Jests, it becomes a one-sided board wipe. And even if that wasn't the case, if we had Ghyrson Starn in play for either Blazing Volley or end the Festivities, we're actually dealing 3 damage to everything on the table that is controlled by your opponents, including your opponents. And that still can generally, it may not board wipe, but it would generally bring the board states down. Next up, we have Flame Fusillade for 3 in red. Until end of turn, permanents you control gain, tap this to have it deal 1 damage to target creature or player. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, all your creatures already do that. That's not true. Not all of my creatures already do that. Most of my creatures do that, but this doesn't say creatures, this says permanents. That means my artifacts, that means my lands, that means my enchantments will all be able to become pingers. And that is outright deadly. And it could potentially end the game. Next up, we have Grape Shot. We don't have a huge amount of instants or sorceries in here, but Grape Shot having Storm is still good on 4 or 3 Storm with Ghyrson in play. Because Grape Shot just deals 1 damage to target creature or player. And if you copy it 3 extra times, that's 3 extra damage times 3. So that's just good value. And then finally we have, well, not finally, sorry. Next up we have Mass Diminish. Mass Diminish is the other version of Polymorphous Jest with 2 minor differences. First off, Polymorphous Jest is a instant, which means you can react with it, and it's far more deadly that way. The other difference is that Polymorphous Jest does not have flashback, whereas Mass Diminish does. So Mass Diminish, the downside here is that you have to play it on your turn specifically during one of your 2 main phases. The upside here is that it has flashback, and that's incredible. The other upside here is that in normal CMC, it actually costs 1 less, I believe, than Polymorphous Jest, and I'm going to have to just go back through here and fact check myself. Yes, it does. It costs 1 less blue to cast. Until your next turn, creatures target player controls have base power and toughness of 1. That's another downside. I didn't realize that until I just read it. Polymorphous Jest hits all of your opponent's creatures, whereas Mass Diminish only hits target players' creatures. So just keep that in mind. Still fantastic card. Flashback does it all. Next up, we have Scouring Sands for 1 and a red. Scouring Sands deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control, and then you get Scry 1. So again, with the Polymorphous Jest, this is a one-sided board wipe. Then we have Smash to Dust. For 1 and a red, you get to choose one. You can destroy target artifact, you can destroy target creature with Defender, or you can have Smash to Dust deal 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. We have a lot of that in here, for obvious reasons. Now, on top of the fact that this can deal 1 damage to each creature my opponents control, it is versatile in the sense that it can also destroy artifacts or creatures with Defender. And while I don't think I'll ever see it being used to destroy a creature with Defender, I will not say it will never happen. The destroying a target artifact, though, will probably happen often. So, very good card. Which leads me to Vandal Blast. Yes, Vandal Blast doesn't do any damage, but again, the idea of being able to destroy all artifacts that my opponents control is kind of powerful, let's be honest. All right, next we're going to take a look at the artifacts. Starting with Arcane Signet, we just got ourselves a Mana Rock in here. You gotta have Mana Rocks, just the way things go. Taps for Commander's Color Identity. Then we have Basilisk Collar. So I like this for 2 reasons. Lifelink is a really fantastic thing. The pingers are still going to net you some life. This is really good on Ghyrson Starn. I don't know if I would put it on a pinger specifically, just because Ghyrson Starn is going to see more triggers than the pingers generally will, and that lifelink will add up. But the big thing here is that it gives Death Touch. So no matter what amount of damage you do, it doesn't matter how big the creature is, unless it has Indestructible or Hexproof, the Death Touch is going to kill it. Next up, we have Caltrops. For 3, whenever a creature attacks, Caltrops deals 1 damage to it. There's not really any downside to this. 9 times out of 10, this isn't going to kill anything, but because Ghyrson Starn will see those triggers, you might kill a bunch of things, especially if it has a Basilisk Collar on. Next up, we have Gorgon's Head. This is in here for the same reason as Basilisk Collar. It is essentially the same thing, with the one downside being that it does not have lifelink. But the most important thing here is about the Death Touch. One of the biggest problems this deck will have is dealing with big creatures, unless they focus all their pingers onto one single target. So Death Touch kind of mitigates that, makes it so that you can deal with big creatures even with just 1 damage. Next up, we have Is It Signet, taps for red and blue. We have Lightning Greaves, equips for free and gives haste and shroud. You can't go wrong with that. Protection is everything. We have Mind Stone, which for 2 you can tap for 1. We have Soul Ring, which for 1 you can tap for 2. And we have Staff of Nin. This costs 6, and that's a lot to pay for an artifact. But there's a beautiful part to this where at the beginning of your upkeep you get to draw a card. Both the Niv Mizzets are going to see that and trigger, but you can also just tap Staff of Nin to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. And I'm sure that there are better Timmy staffs out there, but at the end of the day, the idea that you can also get to draw an extra card during your turn just for having it in play kind of makes up for not running the other Timmy staffs. Then we got Swiftfoot Boots, equips for 1, gives hexproof and haste. Again, we got a lot of protection here. We got Talisman of Creativity, which taps for red or blue, or taps for colorless. You got to be careful with this one again, though. When you tap this for red or blue, it deals 1 damage to you, and Ghyrson Starn will see that. And I know that Ghyrson Starn is supposed to be on your team, but if you deal 1 damage to yourself, Ghyrson Starn will deal 2 damage to you as well. Now, if he has lifelink, then you don't really have much to worry about. But okay, then we have 1,000 Year Elixir for 3. This one's actually really cool because you can activate abilities on creatures you control as though they have haste. So despite the fact that none of these pingers, or not none of them, but a large portion of these pingers will come into play with Summoning Sickness, they still can use their pinger ability, which I think is really cool. But you can also tap 1 and this to untap target creatures. You can just like untap something and ping again just for fun. So it kind of turns the elixir into a pinger. While you also have Flame Fusillade, which can turn it into a pinger, but you know, it is what it is. Very cool card. Very good in this deck. Okay, next up, we're going to look at the enchantments. Right, starting with Aether Sting, and this one is such a mean enchantment. So whenever an opponent plays a creature spell, Aether Sting deals 1 damage to them. I mean, it's just 1 damage, just for playing creatures. For playing Magic, you're taking 1 damage. I love this. This is incredible. It costs 4, but Ghyrson is going to see that, and every time your opponents play creatures, they take 3 damage for playing their creatures. That's upsetting and mean. We got Circle of Flame. Circle of Flame is not a Caltrops, but it is a Caltrops to non-flying creatures, and that's pretty good. For 1 in red, you're basically going to deal 1 damage to whenever a creature without flying attacks you, or a planeswalker you control. Yeah. Whenever they attack. Well, with the upside being that they can attack... Well, actually, I don't know what Caltrops says specifically. If it says they attack and it deals, then it doesn't matter who they attack. But either way, if a creature without flying attacks you or a planeswalker you control, you get to deal 1 damage to it. And with Ghyrson, that's 3. I mean, that's a difference between, do I block it and possibly kill it because it's at low toughness because this flame circle did damage to it already? I mean, that's pretty good. Pretty good. Then we have Curiosity. For 1 blue, you can enchant a creature, and whenever that creature deals damage to an opponent, you get to draw a card. I think that's phenomenal in a pinger deck. Everyone should run it in pinger decks because that's just free draw for dealing ping damage. We have Impact Tremors, another really mean one in here. For 1 and a red, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, Tremor Impact Tremor, deals 1 damage to each opponent. Each opponent. That's beautiful. That's going to be 3 damage with Ghyrson. So on the opposite end, we have the Aether Sting that deals 1 damage to them for playing creatures, and then we have Impact Tremors that deals 1 damage to them whenever I play creatures. So I'm just getting an upside from playing creatures where they just kind of have to be very careful how they do it. Love that. Love it. Super good. We have Mana Barbs. Mana Barbs, again, is one of those double-sided swords. If you're playing Mana Barbs, you better be in a really good board state. In a board state that requires you to spend very little mana. Because Mana Barbs does deal damage to you whenever you tap your lands for mana as well. And Ghyrson will see that. But the potential that it has to really mess up your opponents because they have to tap mana to cast spells. And if you are in the best board position, this is going to force them to take unnecessary amounts of damage just to try and get you out of that board state. So this can be really, really good. It also can be really scary. So again, I'm going to say, do not play Mana Barbs if you are not in the lead. Next up, we have Ophidian Eye. Ophidian Eye is a lot like Curiosity, except that it has Flash, so it costs 2 more to cast. Whenever an enchant creature deals damage to an opponent, you get to draw a card. So again, just drawing cards for that. Then we have Quicksilver Dagger. So Quicksilver Dagger is in here because not all the creatures are pingers. This would be great on a tandem lookout. It's also good on Ghyrson Starn because Ghyrson Starn will see himself dealing 1 damage and then turn around and deal 2 damage. So in general, Quicksilver Dagger is super good. It basically deals 1 damage and draws you a card as well. So you're getting that card draw engine without having to put Ophidian Eye or Curiosity on it. Next up, we have Sigil of Sleep, another really good one, especially if the targets that you're pinging aren't going to die from the amount of damage they're about to take. Sigil of Sleep can actually ice them down. So whenever an enchanted creature deals damage to a player... Oh, it's to a player. Oh, that's even better. Whenever enchanted creature deals damage to a player, return target creature that player... I was thinking of a totally different card, guys. I am so sorry. Sigil of Sleep just bounces creatures for pinging, right? So if you throw this on Ghyrson, and then you start pinging with all the pingers you have, Ghyrson is going to deal damage to the opponent as well. And every time Ghyrson, with the Sigil of Sleep, deals damage to the opponent, you just bounce things off the opponent's board. And is it just creatures? Yeah, it's only creatures, but you're going to bounce some of the worst threats on their board that maybe you couldn't kill. Right? And especially with some of these pingers that can only hit players, this is actually really good. So Sigil of Sleep in here is deadly. Also, for some reason, I thought it was something that allowed you to tap down a creature and they couldn't untap it during their untap step, but I was wrong. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at before we get into the non-basic lands, and there's some non-basic lands in there that are worth noting. We're going to look at Planeswalkers. We have Saheeli Rai. Saheeli Rai has a -7 of search your library for up to 3 artifact cards with different names, put them onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library, which is great. You know, if you want to get the Staff of Nin in play, you want to get the 1,000-year elixir, whatever, if you haven't drawn it already, this is a great way to get it. Its -2 is to create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, except that it's an artifact in addition to its other types, and the token gains haste and it gets exiled until end of turn. I like this one in here because we can copy a pinger and just get a one-time use of that pinger in case we want to close up some damage or if we need to do enough damage to something big. But really what she's in here for is her +1. You get to scry 1, and then she deals 1 damage to each opponent, and that's perfect for Ghyrson. So Saheeli Rai in this deck, the +1 and the -2 are really, really great. The -7 you may not ever need to use, especially if you already got some of those artifacts that you need in play. You may not need to use it, so just keep that in mind. Saheeli Rai, very good. Okay, last of the non-basic lands are last of the non-basic land. I don't know what I'm saying. Basically, we're looking at non-basic lands. Some of this is just going to be typical Izzet lands. So we got the Cascade Bluffs, we got the Command Tower, but then we have cards like Desert. You can tap Desert to deal 1 damage to an attacking creature, and with Ghyrson Starn, we're seeing 3 damage. That could potentially stop that attack from happening. We've got Is It Boilerworks. We got Reliquary Tower. And then we got Shivan Gorge. You can actually tap 2 in a red to tap Shivan Gorge to have it deal 1 damage to each opponent. And again, that's just really good. And it's a good mana sink. If you don't have ways to spend your mana, here you go. Next we have Shivan Reef, and again I have to talk about this because Ghyrson Starn will see this. I have had this really hurt me a lot, but I have found the benefit better than the downside. If you tap the Shivan Reef for blue and red, it deals 1 damage to you, which is the same thing as the Talisman. So Ghyrson will hit you, but like I said, between the 2 cards, I've seen the upsides as being better than downsides, and in both cases you can tap them for colorless without taking any damage. So early game, both of those cards, you can afford to take the damage. Next up we have Steam Vents, we have Storm-Carved Coast, we have Sulphur Falls, then we have Sun-Scorched Desert. Sun-Scorched Desert doesn't tap for color, it only taps for colorless, but when it ETBs, it deals 1 damage to target player. So again, Ghyrson will see that. It's just a cool way to get a bolt out there without actually playing bolt. We got Temple of Epiphany, and then finally we got Training Center. And then the last thing we got is the basic lands in the form of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 islands, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 mountains. So that is the Ghyrson Starn Pinger deck. And I can tell you outright after having played it a couple times that this deck can be very aggressive and it can be very quick, actually. I did build it as the creature pinger deck, so it has obvious downsides in the fact that pingers themselves aren't very tough. It's very easy to kill them. And even if you don't kill them with spot removal, there's always board wipes. So if you commit too much to the board, you can put yourself in a really bad position when a board wipe happens. The other thing here is that, like I said, Ghyrson Starn sees a lot of triggers that will hit you as well in the form of Shivan Reef, Talisman, I think it was Spear Spewer, and I think there's one other card in here. And that can get, Mana Barbs. And that can get really bad very quickly. But again, if you're playing smart, you can kind of play around that. There is another better build for this. There's probably a ton of different builds for this, but the one that I would say is just outright better is the Spellslinger version of this, where we cut down on some of the pingers that we have in here, and we keep only the pingers that can benefit from seeing instants and sorceries played, and then we play more along the lines of cantrips and red spells that deal exactly 1 damage, and then take advantage of things like Grapeshot's Storm ability to close out the game. I think that Spellslinger version is much more consistent. I think that this deck is much more fun to play. But that's just my opinion. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. I will check those as often as I can and get back to you as soon as I can. But let's keep it positive. I will remove any negative comments. And that's it, guys. Until next time, peace.